just the major branches, and then we're done with the synapses. One group, commonly called monotremes, scientific name is Prototheria, and they are probably, there's not too many of them left. There's only 2 species, both of them in Australia. One is in Chinda, and the other is a platypus. And both of these lay eggs. And so the normal condition of mammals probably, of course, was egg laying. Furthermore, and I'm not giving any sort of apomorphy for these because they're relics. They're the only ones that of the egg laying group that survive. And they're very similar as far as their skeletal structures to Mesozoic mammals, which probably, well, we're pretty certain they also laid eggs. They have the milk glands, however, they do not have nipples for those milk glands. And so the young, once they hatch out of the egg, they get the milk from it's secreted onto their fur. And then the young animals will just lick it off of the fur or suck it off of the fur, but there's no nipples. And these are the only 2 monotremes that are left. Another clade is called Theria. So if we were to put these up here for mammals, Theria. And they have nipples associated with the milk glands. That's an apomorphy I'm going to give for them. And within them, the Theria are 2 branches. Metatheria and Eutheria. And the difference between these is that Metatheria are marsupials and the Eutheria are placental mammals. So most of the Metatheria, they still, well, they're mostly originated in southern continents, Australia. There's a lot of marsupials there. South America. And once South America and North America became joined by the Isthmus of Panama, some of these marsupials, opossums, have moved up into the north. Okay, so the apomorphy for these is that there's a pouch called a marsupium. That's what I'm giving as the apomorphy. The young are hatched from eggs inside the uterus. Okay, so it's not real shelled eggs, not like that, but still they don't obtain their nourishment during embryological development from the mother directly. So as the egg was first of all produced before it was fertilized, there's a lot of yolk put there, and the yolk is contains proteins and carbohydrates and lipids, all the things to build the embryo with. And so it will develop from the yolk after it's been fertilized, and then they're born in a very, very immature condition. They're almost still embryos, but still they'll come out the vagina and have to crawl up using the mother's hair up and into this pouch. Okay, it's located down here. In there, that's where the nipple is, that they will then latch onto and be fed milk until they are weaned. So this is how those guys happen to live. Eutheria, these are placental mammals. They have developed a unique structure called a placenta, and some of that placenta develops from extra embryonic tissues. Okay, I mentioned that this is an amniote feature, but some of that placenta involves the allantois and chorion. A lot of times are involved in this. And some of the tissue is from the mother itself. Okay, this is a complex structure where there's no direct connection between the blood supply of the mother and the baby. You can't mix that blood because they're antigenically different. The immune system of the mother would produce antibodies to kill the baby, and vice versa if they came into contact with each other. Since they're not genetically alike, they don't have the same types of proteins. They have a lot in common, but not everything. So there is a capillary bed that's in here so that material can move from the mother's blood into the baby's blood. Waste material can move from the baby's blood into the mother's blood, but their blood does not mix, okay? We'll talk about how these capillaries throughout the body, their exchange systems, how they work. But this is somewhat of a unique thing, so that the fetus is then taken care of. So this is derived in part from extraembryonic tissues, as I said. These are typical marsupials, koala bear, kangaroo, but in Australia there were also carnivores called the Tasmanian wolf, for example. That happened to be, wasn't a wolf, it looked like a wolf, but that was convergent evolution, but it was a marsupial. And in North America we have these ragged eagle things, opossums. These are groups, you don't have to know these, but this is what the mammals, major groups that correspond to a Linnaean order, that many different types of mammals we have here. The only group here on the order scale that I want you to know, and I've already gone through this before, is primates, because that's what the human line belongs to. We're primates, these are other primates, besides monkeys and tarsiers, lemurs, these all belong to this group. And then within the primates, of course, the superfamily Hominoidea, that's what we belong to, along with the other great apes. So Hominoidea is a superfamily that is all the great apes. Yes?
Sorry, quick question. So the primates belong to the eukarya?
That's right. Yeah. And most animals that you think of are mammals are eutherian. Horses, hippopotamuses, giraffes, rats, bats, all of them belong to this group. The only thing that's up here, Mediterranean, are marsupials, which there's not a big abundance of them. All right, so Hominoidea, and this is your lineage. I showed this at the very beginning of the diversity, and many of you look like you're about ready to fall off your chairs, but out of fear, but look where you are now. You should be able to do all this. If you look at all the words there, we've been through it. Okay? Now, there's things missing out down here beyond Hominoidea. Primates, there's a bunch of stuff you can fill in there, but I'm not going to do it. This is the furthest we'll go. All right, and that's the end of the diversity. Any questions? We're moving on to physiology. That's a mammal too. Okay, so now you have a run of the major diversity of life. In the physiology, we're mostly going to concentrate on animals with this part. First of all, just like with the plants, I'll do a little bit later, have to talk about the units that compose the body. We're going to talk about the organs and tissues. So levels of structural organization. I don't know if this is something that Dr. Barnaby last semester happened to emphasize, but I did do in my classes, the hierarchical arrangement of matter in living things. All things are composed, of course, of atoms. So that's not unique to life. Atoms, however, usually do not exist by themselves, but they're in complex with other atoms to form molecules, which is not different from rocks either, non-living things. But when we get into living things, these molecules will form larger structures called macromolecules, supramolecular structures, organelles, cells, and so forth. And that was usually the level of organization that Biology 101A covered. But here with 101B, we go with multicellular organisms. Structural organization goes even higher. Okay, from cells, a group of cells that are united together into a unit that works together as a unit and are dependent on each other is called a tissue. Furthermore, several tissues will cooperate together, be part of a larger structure, organs, and then yet we can have a greater level of complexity. Different organs can join together to form an organ system. And so this is the level in animals that we will be looking at, okay? So as I said, what the tissue is, the groups of similar cells that organized into a unit that they depend on each other, and all this unit has a particular function, okay? Sometimes, usually, it's more than one cell type, but we can still have cells that are basically the same type, but they're still dependent on each other. They cannot exist by themselves. All right, so types of tissues in animals, 4 categories. 4 categories, and within each of these categories, there are subtypes. And so I'm going to go over the unique characteristics of different types of tissues and their subgroups. Because when we get into the physiology of how your organ systems work, respiratory system, digestive system, circulatory system, we'll have to be looking at these tissues because they're all important. First type of tissue is epithelial tissues. I already mentioned them before. Now I'm going to add a little bit more to what epithelial tissues happen to be. These consist of tightly packed cells. So the cells are tightly packed, close together, very little extracellular matrix in between them, and the sides of the cell membranes are linked together by protein junctions, which in vertebrates happen to be called tight junctions. Now, so what this does is it creates a sheet of cells. So it's 2-dimensional sheet, sometimes a 3-dimensional sheet, that will separate different fluid compartments or air compartments in the body. So that one side of this epithelium may have certain properties different from the other side. For material to move from one side to the other, they have to pass through the agency of the cell. Because of the tight junctions, molecules cannot move in between cells. And therefore that gives a living substance, the cell, the selectivity to allow certain things to cross while preventing other things from crossing. These are found lining the organs and cavities within the body. What extracellular matrix exists is only found on one side of the epithelium. So this system of cells, this tissue can be called an epithelium or an epithelial tissue, okay? But it has here something that's called a basal lamina. That's only on one side, basal lamina. Frequently the textbooks will say a basement membrane, and I want to caution you that a lot of times the words in biology can, the same word can mean totally different things. Because we usually, when I'm referring to a membrane, we're talking about a cell membrane, okay, a phospholipid bilayer. That's not what we mean here by basement membrane. This is not a phospholipid bilayer. It's not a cell membrane. It is extracellular matrix. An extracellular matrix is just a loose meshwork of proteins, proteoglycans, structural carbohydrates that are outside of the plasma membrane. They're loose enough that we don't call it a cell wall. Okay, cell walls are pretty dense, non-dynamic, and this is still rather non-dynamic, but it's not so dense. Furthermore, there is what is called basal-apical polarity in these cells. What that means is that the function of plasma membranes on one side of the cell functions differently than the plasma membrane on the other side. If you have a regular cell that has space all around it, then whatever proteins, transporters, and that are in the membrane, you'd find the same ones all the way around. The plasma membrane would not differ from one place to the next. But with this particular type of situation, protein transporters that might be in the apical plasma membrane will not be found in the basal plasma membrane. Furthermore, you have different types of proteins in the basal plasma membrane than what you find in the apical plasma membrane. and the two sides of the cell function differently from each other, okay? They're not like a regular cell where the membrane function is the same all the way around. So this is what we mean by basal apical polarity. Okay, now why do you think, because if we had a protein transporter here, why do you think it would stay there? The membranes are fluid. Things move laterally, including proteins. Why would it not diffuse around to the other side? What do you think? This should be something clear from Biology 101A. Why or how can you have a component that's in a fluid membrane stay in place?
Based on polarity?
What?
Based on polarity?
Well, they are polar across here, across the membrane within the protein itself, but that wouldn't prevent it from moving.
Cholesterol?
What?
Cholesterol?
No, cholesterol moves. Cholesterol wouldn't hold it in space. What else? What other idea do you have?
Concentration?
What?
Concentration?
No, concentration wouldn't play a role. That doesn't keep things moving. What do you do if you have a boat and you don't want it to float out into the ocean?
Anchor it.
You anchor it. Okay, there's something called cytoskeleton. Okay, there's components of the cytoskeleton that happen to be rigid. Some parts are dynamic, like microtubules and microfilaments. They're coming and going, but there is intermediate fibers that they're usually permanent. So you can anchor it. And also, these tight junctions, which go all the way around, they also create a barrier to prevent things from moving from one side to the other. Okay, so yeah. So for anything to go across this, there's going to be exceptions. Okay, for example, the epithelium that forms capillaries, they're a little leaky, and that's a special condition. We'll come back to that when we get to the circulatory system. But by and large, materials cannot passively, or not passively, but down the concentration gradient. Even if there's concentration gradient there, the cell has control of it. Okay, that's the important thing here. All right, so these epithelial tissues, there's two ways in which they're classified. By two different principles. One of them is that they're classified by the shapes of the cells on the apical side. Okay, the shapes of the cells. Shells can be flat, scale-like, in which case it's called a squamous epithelium. Or they can be sort of box-like shells, in which case it's called cuboidal epithelium. And otherwise they can be sort of column-shaped, where they're longer in one dimension than they are in another dimension, and therefore that's called columnar. Okay? So these are the three general cell shapes. Now obviously you have everything in between. However, when we're talking about these epithelium, we force them into one category or the other in terms of the shapes of the cells. But this isn't the only way in which they're classified. It's also by the number of layers that compose the cell or the epithelium. Okay, for one, if it has just one layer of cells, then it is called a simple epithelium. If it has more than one layer of cells, like our skin, for example, it is called stratified. Yes?
So I know there's like cocci, bacilli, and spirally. Is that the same as these shapes? Or,
Say it again.
I know there's like the cocci, bacilli, and the spirally cells, like you learned about last semester. Are these like the same as those, like the cell shapes?
No, because that's bacteria. Okay, she's talking about bacillus, coccus, spirillus. Those are referring to the shapes of bacterial cells. Okay, these aren't bacterial cells. And furthermore, these are not these aren't the same. All right, so now, both of these terms are used to characterize the epithelium, stating with the number of layers first. So you can have a simple squamous epithelium, simple cuboidal epithelium, simple columnar epithelium, or you have stratified squamous, stratified columnar, stratified cuboidal. However, when it's stratified, like in our skin, a lot of times all the cells are not the same shape. So the shape component, squamous, cuboidal, or columnar, given to the epithelium is based on the apical most layer of cells. The apical most layer of cells. So for example, with skin, epidermis in us, you have the basal lamina, but these cells down here are cuboidal, more or less, and they become flatter, until they are incredibly flat on the outside. And so we have several layers. This is the basal side, this is the apical side. And so on the outside of your skin, these are real flat cells. This is stratified, and therefore type of epithelium it is a stratified squamous epithelium, because the outer apical most cells are flat. Okay? All right. There's one other category here called pseudostratified, and it's found in the trachea and bronchi of your respiratory system. Usually that's the only place it is. I think there's one other place. It's actually one layer, but it sort of looks like it's stratified. And this is simply because the shape of the cells are different, and some of them are fat near the basement, near the basal side. Others are fatter up here. And so it looks like there's two or more layers of cells because of the location of the nuclei. Now, these are animals, and therefore they have plasma membranes, but no cell walls. And therefore, when you have these cells right next to each other, looking through the microscope, you can't tell most of the time where the plasma membrane is. What you can see is the nucleus. And therefore, the pseudostratified, I'll show some pictures here in just a moment. All right, so this here is simple squamous. This here is the basal lamina. Cells up here are flat. It's right here, stratified, squamous. Although down here, where the basal lamina happens to be, those are cuboidal cells. However, up here, the apical surface, they are squamous. And therefore, that's a stratified squamous. So this is what skin would look like. You'll see a lot of these types of things in the kidneys. It's a simple cuboidal. This out here is another type of tissue. The epithelium is this. It's a tube, okay? And this is the lumen of the tube. This here is the basal side. This is the apical side. One layer of cells, and they're box shaped. So this is a simple cuboidal epithelium, and so forth. This is columnar. This is muscle down here, and there's a little bit of connective tissue right in there. But this right here is the basal lamina, and these are the cells. They are long and thin, columnar. So this is a simple columnar epithelium. And just some more. Simple columnar here. This is simple cuboidal. This is pseudostratified, okay? Because how many layers of cells do you think are there? If I didn't tell you that there's only one. Looks like maybe about two. One layer right here, because these are the nuclei, and there's nuclei up here as well. This is where the basal lamina happens to be. This is a cell that is sort of wide down here, but it's real thin going up here. And so this here is one that's wide at the top, but then it's real thin. Actually, it looks like it goes over there. So, but this is just one layer of cells, simple, pseudostratified. Okay? So those are the epithelial cells. The second category of tissues happen to be connective tissues. And the function of connective tissues are to hold or to support other tissues. Now, that supporting other tissues might be mechanically, or it might be nutritionally. Okay, it can go both ways, or metabolically. So they're characterized by a sparse population of cells. The cells are not close to each other. There's a lot of space between the cells most of the time, and there's extensive amounts of extracellular matrix. And that's extracellular matrix. It can be a semi-solid, it can be a solid, it can be gel-like, or it can be even water, okay, liquid, depending on what tissue we're talking about. So this is the functions to hold other tissues together if it's mechanical in its function, but it also can support, and I'm using this word support in a very broad way, support other tissues, can be metabolically or nutritionally. And this extracellular matrix contains various components, but a lot of times there's also structural proteins that happen to be there, and that form large fibers. So the monomer happens to be one particular type of protein. For example, collagen, you can have collagen monomer, which has an N-terminus and a carboxyl terminus. It's just one string of amino acids. But to make a collagenous fiber, you'd have to take several of these units and put them together in a larger structure. And that's usually what the case is in these protein fibers. 3 different types of fibers that are there. Very common, collagen. And tissues that have this, they resist stretching. They have, that's said, they have great tensile strength. But there's also elastic fibers made of a protein called elastin. So collagen fibers, of course, are made of collagen, multiple units of collagen. Elastin, many of them form elastic fibers. These can recoil. They can stretch and store the energy and then stretch back once the pressure is released back to their original shape. So that allows some connective tissues to stretch. This is why you can pull your cheek out, let go, and it doesn't stay there. Okay, it goes back. Now, of course, this breaks down with time, and so I don't pull my cheek out very often, okay, because I think it will stay there. All right, and then a third type, reticular fibers. I'm not giving the name of the protein that those reticular fibers are made out of, but nonetheless, they form anchors joining one type of tissue to another. So these are 3 types of tissue, 3 types of fibers that you find in connective tissues. Okay, so the major groups of connective tissues. One of them that's real common is called loose connective tissue. This is a cartoon from your book showing what it looks like. This is the actual microscope slide showing what it will look like. And you'll see this in lab after you come back from spring break. So these have all 3 types of fibers in it. Yes?
I'm sorry, what was the last fiber?
Okay, reticulate. Okay. Let me back up. There's the word right there. Got it?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so this contains all types of these fibers, plus, you know, matrix that is jelly-like matrix that is secreted out of these cells. The cells that form this are called fibroblasts or fibrocytes. Okay, fibrocytes. But fibrocytes come into 2 different categories. Fibroclasts fibroblasts. One of them, fibroclasts, it breaks down the tissue, the extracellular matrix, whereas the fibroblasts happen to secrete it. Because this tissue can be remodeled. So the extracellular matrix, depending on the stresses that it faces, can be remodeled. And these cells are all involved in it. But nonetheless, they are the ones that secrete the extracellular matrix. There's another type of tissue, this is actually an immune cell, immune system cell called macrophages. They're amoeboid, and you find them everywhere in the body. Okay, not just only in loose connective tissues, but these crawl through the area looking for bacteria and viruses and other things that shouldn't be there. When we get to the immune system, we'll talk about those. Okay, so There's also something called dense connective tissue. And this is what it looks like. Parallel lines of collagenous fibers. Notice that the collagen up here is loose, okay? The bigger purple lines here, now on the slides that we'll have, it'll look more purple, or excuse me, more pink, but these are called collagenous fibers. These dark fibers in here are elastic fibers. But if you notice the direction of these collagenous fibers, they can be any direction. They're lying like that, they're not necessarily parallel to each other. But in dense tissue, they are pretty well parallel to each other. Okay, that gives this tissue very strong tensile strength so that it cannot stretch very much. Okay, adds to that. And of course, cells that happen to, so tendons, these happen to be a form of dense connective tissue. They attach bone to bone, whereas other tissues, muscles attached to bones are ligaments. Excuse me, the other way around. Ligaments, bone to bone, tendons, muscle to bone. Okay, and but basically they're the same type of tissue. They're just given different names simply based on what they're connecting together. Types of cells that secrete all this, because they have living cells, you usually can only see the nuclei. Those are fibrocytes. Okay, so fibrocytes in this type of tissue as well. Cartilage is another type of connective tissue. In this case, it is sort of a solid, flexible solid that forms the extracellular matrix. And so it contains sulfated proteoglycan called chondroitin sulfite. So a proteoglycan, what is a proteoglycan? It's a type of structural polysaccharide and protein. Okay, the proteo indicates protein, glycan indicates carbohydrates. So there's structural carbohydrates that are covalently bound to proteins, a lot of times things like collagen. But the glycan part, these are what are sulfated, not the protein. Okay, the sulfur is on, the sulfates happen to be attached to the carbohydrate, sugar portions of this. That forms, and what secretes it is chondrocytes, types of cells. And we have the same type of relationship with the chondrocytes as with the fibrocytes, chondroblasts and chondroclasts. I left out the ill. One of them forming, the other one breaking down the extracellular matrix. Because also this, depending on if it was injured, damaged, or changing stresses on it, this can be remodeled. Okay, now since this extracellular matrix happens to be a solid, it has where the cells have to be. They have to be in open spaces, cavities, they're called lacuna. So the lacuna is the cavity, and the cell happens to be located inside. So these cells will secrete collagen fibers, the chondroitin sulfate, and secrete it outside of the cell to form the cartilage. And there's different types of cartilage. Some of it is flexible, like in your ear or the tip of your nose. Other cartilage that is in between the joints, like at your knee joint, elbow, between the bones, tends to be a little bit harder. And then a third, or another type of connective tissue here is adipose tissue, fat tissue. Now, this does not, fat tissue doesn't fit the definition of connective tissue that I gave earlier, saying that they're widely spaced cells. Here, they're tightly pressed together. There's not a lot of extracellular matrix. However, these cells also are not, the cell membranes also are not bound to each other by tight junctions, okay, or protein junctions. So this is an exception as far as connective tissues happen to be. All these are adipocytes, and the major function of these is to store fat as fuel, okay? So any molecule in your body, whether it is a protein, a carbohydrate, or a lipid, can be burned in the mitochondria to make ATP in cellular respiration. However, animals have evolved using sugars first. And so we have a store, when you eat, you have a store of carbohydrate in your liver that can last for about 1 day of glycogen. Throughout the day, if you didn't eat, that eventually gets broken down into glucose, released in the blood, and the cells metabolize it. Long-term storage of energy is for lipids. So lipids are stored here. So the preference of an animal is, first of all, to burn the carbohydrates, after which you start burning fat, okay? And then after you run out of fat, then you start burning proteins, and that's a problem, okay? Because a lot of the proteins are taken from your muscle and from other important blood proteins, and that's when you're really in dire starvation conditions. Okay, so that's a major storage here, but also this fat has other functions as well. It insulates. You find a lot of mammals that are homeothermic, maintaining a constant body temperature, living in Arctic oceans and Antarctic waters where it's real cold, and their skin underneath their epidermis has a very thick layer of adipose tissue. So this insulates the body. Some function of adipose tissue that wasn't appreciated until within the last 30 years or so is that this is a major organ that produces hormones. A lot of these hormones control inflammation, swelling in the body, and energy balance. The inflammation is really a big deal here because people who are obese or overweight will a lot of times have problems with inflammation. And it's because of this adipose tissue having to release it. There's also a type of adipose tissue. This is just called white adipose tissue, but most infant mammals have another type of tissue that is called brown adipose tissue. And its function is not to store energy, but to produce heat. Okay, now in this case, instead of using the lipids in cellular respiration to produce ATP, they produce a protein. There's a gene that produces, when it's expressed, called uncoupling protein 1. And what this does is it unlinks the hydrogen ion gradient across the membrane of the mitochondria, so that instead of producing ATP, all that energy is just simply released as heat. This is found mostly in babies. In humans, babies are born with it too. It's a way to keep them warm, okay? The young, keeping them warm. Adult humans do not have this, but other animals might have some of this brown adipose tissue. What scientists are now trying to do, and they're trying to get white adipose tissue to produce this protein so that it can be aided in weight loss, because this here, all the energy, instead of being stored as fat, simply losses heat. Okay, and then another connective tissue is bone. Bone starts out most of the time as cartilage, and then it's mineralized afterwards. And so it is a type of mineralized tissue. And the types of cells that are here that deposit and remodel are called osteocytes. Same type of relationship, osteoblast, osteoclasts, okay? Because the bone also gets remodeled, okay? Depending on changes in stress, injuries, etc., the bone can be remodeled. And so these osteocytes, they have to live in lacunae as well. They deposit and produce the extracellular matrix, which consists of collagen and a solid crystal calcium phosphate. Okay, so calcium phosphate is crystal, and that's what makes up the bone. Now, there's several subcategories of bone. We're not going to go into it, but most remodeled bone have these circular systems under the microscope, okay, when you look at it. And these are called Haversian systems. So there is a central canal, which is also called the Haversian canal. This is where blood vessels and nerves go. Because even though this is solid, it has to have a way, it has living cells in there. And those living cells have to have a nutritional supply. Furthermore, the bone has sensory systems that can tell whether it's being broken or stresses that happen to be on it. And so that's through that canal is where this happens to go. Blood vessels, etc. This is what it would look like under the microscope. Then there's the concentric rings of deposited calcium phosphate. And so these dark spots up here, these are the lacunae. The lacunae is just a space, and it's inside that lacunae is where the chondrocytes happen to be. They can't move around, they're pretty much stuck where they are. Okay, this is the structure of bone. And then the last connective tissue is blood. Might not have thought of blood as being a connective tissue, but it does connect various organs as a highway, a traffic through which waste material, nutrients, hormones happen to travel. Okay? So in this case, the extracellular matrix is plasma. Plasma is mostly water, but there's also salts, various types of proteins that happen to be dissolved in there as well. This constitutes plasma, and there's blood proteins there as well. The cellular components, three different categories. Leukocytes, these are commonly called white blood cells. Scientific name is leukocytes, and there's a lot of different types of leukocytes. When we get to the blood lab, we will, only in lab, will we pay attention to the different types of leukocytes. Here in lecture, it's just general, okay? All these leukocytes are involved in defense, okay, of the body. I mentioned macrophages earlier. They happen to be a type of leukocyte. Red blood cells, this is by and large the largest population of cells in the blood. These are called, scientific name is erythrocytes. And their function is to transport oxygen, okay? To maintain a constant body temperature like we do requires a lot of energy. And a lot of oxygen is therefore necessary to go to those cells for cellular respiration. That's why we breathe, is for the oxygen, for cellular respiration. But one problem here is that we're warm-blooded, okay? Our body is, the fluid, the plasma is warm, and there's a relationship between the solubility of gases and liquids that are dependent on temperature. The higher the temperature, the less soluble they are. Okay, therefore, we wouldn't, if we didn't have some way to increase the oxygen supply, carrying capacity of the blood, we would keel over. All right, so that's what the red blood cells are for. At maturity, red blood cells do not have a nucleus, nor do they have mitochondria. They come from precursor cells that do have a nucleus, do have mitochondria, but at maturity, these are completely broken down. No mitochondria, because the mitochondria require oxygen. These are specialized to carry oxygen. They're stuffed with protein hemoglobin, okay? So if they do not have mitochondria, where do they get their ATP from? They're still alive. They still have metabolic activity. They're not just passive little carriers. Where did they get their ATP? Glucose? How? You're right. They do burn glucose. What?
From insulin.
From what?
From insulin?
No.
Insulin,
No. They do break down glucose. They break glucose down into lactic acid. And that's all further and go. So what process would break glucose down to lactic acid? fermentation, what's another name for it? It's not quite fermentation in this case, but yeah, but you're close. Who said that? You or you? Oh, you did. With masks, I can't tell where anything's coming from. But what is the part of cellular respiration that happens first? Glycolysis. That's all they have is glycolysis. But that produces enough ATP for them because their metabolic demand is very high. All right, and then there's third component here is cell fragments. They're not complete cells. They come from a precursor cell that breaks off little bits of plasma membrane. These are called platelets. And the platelets, they are for part of the clotting process. And they're real important for filling up a hole when the integrity of the circulatory system, because it's a closed circulatory system, blood is supposed to stay there, gets injured, okay? So looking at this slide up here, this here is a leukocyte. Leukocytes have a nucleus, okay? And these have been stained such that nucleic acids will show up. These are the erythrocytes. These little things right here, they still stain. These are the platelets, okay? And so those are the cellular components in blood. Okay, the third tissue. So I've gone through epithelial tissues and connective tissues. Now it's nervous tissue. Okay, so it's the third type. And these cells are capable of transmitting signals, electrical signals. When we get to the nervous system a little bit later on, you'll see that it's not electrons like what are powering the lights up here or your electrical devices. It's still the movement of charge. Okay, that's really what current is, the movement of charge, not necessarily in the form of electrons. In the nervous system, it's primarily potassium and chlorine and sodium ions. Okay, the major cells, group of cells here are neurons. And there's many different categories of neurons. We're not going to look at different categories of neurons, but a typical neuron, this is going to be a sensory or motor neuron that I'm illustrating up here, that you might mostly find in your peripheral nervous system instead of in the brain so much. They have a part here called the cell body, and that's where the location of most of the organelles happen to be. So the nucleus is there, endoplasmic reticulum is there, and most of the mitochondria happen to be there as well. However, the mitochondria can be in other places as well. They have cytoplasmic processes that are sticking out. There's two different types of processes that come from cell body. One group is called dendrites, the other is called axons. In peripheral nerves and both sensory nerves, motor nerves, the axons are generally longer, the dendrites are generally shorter, but that is not the difference between dendrites and functional difference between dendrites and axons. Because in neurons in the brain, in certain places, you may find the relationship the other way around, that the dendrites might be longer. The real definition here between these two is that the dendrites are receiving electrical signals from other nerve cells and propagating that electrical signal toward the cell body, whereas in axons, the electrical signal is being transmitted away from the cell body, okay? And that's the real difference. When we get to the nervous system, we'll look at that. It's a very complicated process. But in addition to the neurons, there's also all sorts of glial cells. And these are supporting cells that they're usually much smaller. Up here, these are neurons, that's a cell body. Cell body. But these smaller cells that you see as points up here, those happen to be glial cells. Some of these glial cells have a variety of functions. Some of them function very much like immune system cells, because the brain is very highly protected. Has a blood supply that goes in there, but there are certain glial cells that wrap around capillaries. It's called the blood-brain barrier. So they prevent or they control what can come out of the blood system and get to the neurons. Okay, This makes it a real big problem sometimes for diseases of the brain, because various types of medications that you normally put into your blood system will not get into the brain because of the blood-brain barrier. Some of these glial cells function like macrophages. Okay, you won't find macrophages in the brain. They're part of the immune system. These are fulfilling that role. Okay, that's all I have to say about the nervous system. We'll get into it a little bit more when we get further down the road. Fourth and final tissue is muscle tissue. Both nervous tissues, muscle tissue, epithelial tissues, all these are unique to animals, as we already came across earlier, or at least eumetazoans. All right, so these are capable of contraction. Now, even in a single cell, they're still capable of motion, like amoebae do move. And things that we've seen before, dinoflagellates, they do move. And the principle for that type of motion was the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton. Also in larger units, such as muscles, that are capable of motion, it is cytoskeletal elements that are real important here. So there's systematic arrangement of actin. And what do actin, that's the monomer for what type of cytoskeletal fiber? There's 3 cytoskeletal fibers: microtubules, microfilaments, and intermediate filaments. Actin is the monomer of which one of those? For microfilaments. Okay, so myosin is a motor protein. Okay, motor proteins. Dr. Barnes will talk about motor proteins, dynin and kinesins. Okay, this is another type of motor protein. We have several different isoforms of myosin. When I say isoforms, they're due to gene duplications, and so they produce a different form of myosin depending on what cell type they have to be in. This is a special type of myosin that you don't need to know its number, but nonetheless, these are what's real important here. So there's 3 different types of animal muscle, and they differ from each other in their structure and branching pattern, how many nuclei a typical cell happens to have, and whether it is voluntary or non-voluntary. Most of our muscle is skeletal, so it's anchored to bones. It has an insertion on one bone, usually across some sort of joint that bends or turns, and has an insertion on another bone on the other side of that junction, and therefore its contraction leads to the movement of that part of the body. And this is for voluntary motion. When I say voluntary, is that you have conscious control of it. Now, you can learn by habit not to have to think about it. Okay, so when I'm saying voluntary, like it isn't every time if you're thinking of something else that you fail to be able to walk. Okay, you still walk, but you have conscious control over it. Okay, so the muscle's attached by tendons to the bone. And of course, when these microfilaments, actin microfilaments, are aligned, then the muscle looks striated. So when I say striated, it's like this. Through the microscope, you see a thick line, then a light line, and a real thin, dark line, another thin, light line, and then a dark line. They repeat, repeat, repeat. And this is because of the regular arrangement of these microfilaments. And when we get to muscle, we'll look at that in more detail. We won't bother with it right here. That's what we mean by striations. You can see these lines that are going across the muscle. Whether they're non-branching, so that means the muscle fiber has a branch point, or whether it's straight, whether it is multinucleate, cenocytic. Where did we see that word before? What is cenocytic? It's another word for multinucleate, but it's not dikaryotic. Okay, the nuclei are identical. They're genetically identical. Okay, so the 3 types of muscle: skeletal muscle. We go back here. Skeletal muscle. These are the properties of skeletal muscle. Non-branching. Yeah.
So
Yes.
When you get a cramp, is that an example of involuntary movement?
No, that's, well, yeah, it's not what we mean by voluntary, okay, or non-voluntary. Yes, you can't think it away, that's true. There's chemical things going there that causes the muscle to contract. But, normally, so these words, voluntary, involuntary, they mean that you do have conscious control over it, but not necessarily when it's a physiological problem. Okay, that's a physiological problem. And just like cutting your muscle, you don't have control of what's happening there either. And so those are different conditions. Here, I mean, you don't have to think. I mean, you can refrain from the motion if you want. So skeletal muscle is voluntary, striated, non-branching, multinucleated. And I'm going to have those 4 items compared with the next 2 groups of muscle. Cardiac muscle is only in the heart. Only in the heart. And so this is a vertebrate thing. Okay? You wouldn't find cardiac muscle in the heart of a lobster. Okay, that's a different type of muscle that happens to be there. So this is a cardiac. It is like skeletal muscle, striated. You can look at it and see the striations there. And it is branched. In other words, these cells are connected to each other in a fiber, and the fibers will branch and split apart. Okay, that is not the case with skeletal muscle. And thankfully, it is involuntary. You don't have to think about it. Otherwise, many of us would be dead, all right? Because we would be daydreaming and forget to pump our heart, all right? So, and it's mononucleated. So these are relatively small cells. Each cell has its own single nucleus, unlike the large muscle fibers of skeletal muscle. And then the third category of muscle here happens to be smooth muscle. Now, this is only found inside of various organs of the body. Okay, and it is also involuntary. It's completely controlled by your unconscious mind. You can't think about it. Even if you want to think about pushing your food through your digestive system, you cannot control it. And in fact, part of the nervous system that is in the digestive system is a brain all to itself. You have no control over it. It thinks for itself. But other skeletal muscle happens to be scattered throughout blood vessels and other organs in the body. These particular cells are not striated, okay, because the arrangement of the microfilaments here is quite different, and the cells are sort of spindle-shaped. Usually in the muscle, they're put real close together, all right? But, so here's one spindle cell connected to another cell, connected to another cell, and so forth. That's the nucleus, and so they're single, mononucleated, and involuntary. Spindle-shaped cells, they contract slowly, and this is only for involuntary motions. Non-striated, non-branching, and mononucleated. Okay? Because even though this might look like it's branched, it's not. It's relatively straight. It's just that this here has muscles that in the cutout, when they cut across here, that you're seeing different layers. And these are the 3 types of muscle. Okay, so those are the 4 types of tissues, they're subgroups, and we can come back with exercise 12. Exercise 12 is on looking at slides of all these. Okay, now organs. Organs are organized, consist of more than one tissue. So we have tissue, layer after layer, that form the organ. A good example here of an organ is the intestine. And it consists of several layers of tissues. Looks like I have a hyperlink that doesn't work. Okay, we'll just look here. Even with your stomach, it doesn't have to be the intestine, it's also true of the stomach as well. There's several layers of tissues. From the innermost part, in the lumen, there is a layer of epithelium. It's a simple columnar epithelium. epithelium. And that epithelium is called the mucosa. Don't worry about that now, because when we get into the digestive system, that word will come back. Underneath that layer is a layer of connective tissue. Then underneath that, this is going from the lumen out, So this is the lumen, so here's the epithelium, a layer of connective tissue, and then several layers of muscle, smooth muscle. In fact, there's 3 layers of smooth muscle here. One of them happens to be longitudinal, going the length of the organ, so that it would, when they contract, they shorten the organ. Another is circular, they go around, so that when these contract, they squeeze food down. And then there's oblique layer, it's going in between. Furthermore, there's blood vessels and nervous tissue that are all peppered all the way through here. And then on the very outside of the muscle is yet another layer of connective tissue. And so all these are important for this particular organ. So organs are made out of tissues such as that. Now, for mammals and vertebrates, a lot of your internal organs are connected to your dorsal side, the back. Now, we're funny because really we think of dorsal as being up here because we're not on 4 legs. However, if we're on 4 legs like most mammals are, then a lot of these organs inside of your body are connected to the dorsal side by sheets of connective tissue that are called mesomeres. So for us, we still have that. All of our organs attached to your back, but when we're standing up, that's putting a lot of pressure on those mesenteries because gravity is pulling them in a different way than if you were horizontal. And consequently, people often hemorrhage these. We can, for example, people working with a jackhammer will tear these mesenteries very frequently. Then beyond organs, organ systems, where we have several organs that are joined together for the same process. They function and perform coordinated tasks, and one of the best examples here is your digestive system. You have your mouth, which is an organ, teeth, which you can constitute as a different organ, stomach, there's also esophagus, stomach, large, small intestine, associated glands such as pancreas, gallbladder. These are all part of your digestive system, which is an organ system whose function is to process the food you eat, to absorb that food into your body so that it can be used, and to be rid the body of undigestible material. Okay, so we'll see that again and again. So as a prelude to the lectures that are coming up, I want to point out that animals are heterotrophs. Okay, we have to get our carbon supply energy pre-made from the environment. Okay, we cannot make our own ATP from our own energy sources. Therefore, nutrition is a big deal. So one of the first organ systems that I'm going to look at, I'll get to on Thursday, in fact, is digestion. And gas exchange. Get rid of carbon dioxide and eliminate carbon dioxide, acquire oxygen. Why do we need oxygen? Why do we need oxygen? Cellular respiration. Okay, real important. And one of the byproducts is carbon dioxide, and we got to get rid of it. Okay, so that's gas exchange, and getting rid of metabolic waste. This is not the same thing as getting rid of unprocessed food you can't digest. That undigested food that goes out the back end was never in your body to begin with. Okay, in a physiological sense that I'm talking about. We are donuts. We have an opening at both ends, and there's a long tube that goes from mouth to anus. And really that stuff is continuous with the outside world, okay? It really doesn't get into you until it's taken across the epithelium into your blood system. Then it's physiologically in, okay? This here is metabolic waste. because your cells create waste, mostly nitrogenous waste. Okay, the deamination of proteins, amino acids, we have the carbon skeleton. That carbon skeleton can be used in cellular respiration, but the amine group becomes ammonia. And we can't do anything with ammonia. It's highly toxic, and we have to get rid of it. So that's one of the things of this elimination system. And furthermore, the control of pH and ions in our internal fluids, they have to be regulated, highly regulated. If the pH inside of your body changes by 0.2 pH units, you're dead. Okay, so it's highly regulated. And so these are systems that we're going to look at how it's done. Okay? Now, if an animal is small and thin and lives in water, usually they don't have some of these organ systems. Indeed, they have to have a system for obtaining nutrients, but a lot of times not a respiratory system for gas exchange. That can be done by simple diffusion. They don't have to have a circulatory system. Simply diffusion will work just fine. Elimination of metabolic waste, ammonia is very soluble in water. And so if they're in that type of system, they don't have too many things. But as you get bigger and thick, then diffusion just doesn't do it. Therefore, we have to have special types of systems for respiration, special types of systems for getting rid of metabolic waste, and furthermore, something else that's also needed, because all these systems are usually localized, but they have to communicate with each other, and therefore a circulatory system that holds them all together, okay, that joins them all together. This is what is really important. Okay, everyone have this slide? Okay. And for distribution, that's what I said, a circulatory system. Circulatory system for distribution. And so this is a cartoon that I made, okay? It's pretty, isn't it? Anyway, sort of illustrating what I'm going to talk about first. Digestive system, then respiratory, circulatory system, excretory system, then we'll get into the nervous system, and so forth. Okay? All right, that's where I stopped. Okay, any questions? Anything you need to see? Okay, so Thursday, I don't know if I have the slides up, but I'll make sure they're up to date for the digestive system. So we're getting into digestive system. That's good. Okay, this is what I'm glad you brought that up. Lecture quiz after spring break. Okay, what's it going to do? It's going to start with where I begin here. In fact, I was reviewing birds. Let's forget the birds that have just only the mammals. Okay, and this, and where I get with digestion. Okay, just two lectures. But coming back on Monday and having a quiz right away is sort of a bummer, right? You want it on Wednesday. Okay, so that's what I planned. Is Monday for lab, you only have, I don't know that I'm going to start 12 because we have the sharp section, problem section. I'll probably 12 on Wednesday. I'll let you know whether or not there's going to be a quiz for 12. Okay, but there won't be a lecture quiz. Lecture quiz will be on Wednesday, but it will only cover this week. Okay, it won't cover next the Tuesday after. Okay. All right. Yes. Yeah, so all these are going to be projected on PowerPoint. Yeah, so they're all, so I've taken pictures of